A stack of 19th century census pages holds a lie that an entire Appalachian community spent 200 years defending, and one envelope of DNA results just tore it apart. The story says the Melungeons descended from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors. That's wrong. What actually happened is a secret bloodline hidden for 2 centuries because Tennessee's own laws made the truth too dangerous to say out loud. Jack Goins built the DNA project meant to finally prove his family's Portuguese, maybe native blood. Instead, it told him the one word his family had spent 200 years making sure nobody ever said. It happened on Newman's Ridge, Hancock County, Tennessee, home to the most contested mixed-race mystery in American history, and it still isn't settled. Before you understand what that envelope did to a man's sense of who he was, you have to understand what the Melungeons are, and why an entire people spent 2 centuries defending a story that the paperwork never quite agreed with. Up on Newman's Ridge, in the far northeastern corner of Tennessee, and across the state line into Virginia, there is a cluster of families whose surnames repeat like a chant: Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, Mullins, Bolin. For generations, these families lived clustered on the ridge and down in a narrow valley called Vardy, isolated from the surrounding towns by geography and by something harder to name. They were not accepted as white by their neighbors. They were not accepted as black either. They were something else, something the surrounding world did not have a comfortable box for, and the world responded to that discomfort with a word: Melungeon. Nobody knows exactly where the word comes from. Maybe French from melange, meaning mixture. Maybe Afro-Portuguese from melungo, meaning shipmate. Maybe Turkish from Melungeon, meaning cursed soul. Maybe Greek from Milan, meaning black. 5 plausible roots, 5 continents, and not one of them settled after 2 centuries of arguing. What is documented is where the word first appears in writing. Not in a proud family Bible, not in a census record. It shows up in 1813 in the minutes of the Stony Creek Baptist Church in Russell County, Virginia, where a congregation member is accused of harboring them Melungeons. It was not a name this community chose. It was an accusation written down by people who wanted them gone. And yet, by the 20th century, this same word had become the center of a proud identity, an outdoor stage drama, a museum, a heritage association, a national conversation about who counts as American. In 1969, Hancock County, at the time ranked among the poorest counties in the United States, staged an outdoor drama called Walk Toward the Sunset, turning the Melungeon story into live theater performed for tourists on the very ground where the families had once hidden their identity out of fear. The production drew a bomb threat from locals uncomfortable with the subject being staged at all, and ran anyway for years. A word that started as a weapon used against a community became, within a single lifetime, a stage production the same community performed with pride. Descendants formed heritage associations. A whole genre of amateur historians spent decades chasing down where these families really came from. And for most of that time, the answer they wanted was Europe or the Mediterranean, almost never Africa. That's the first crack. If you go back and read the earliest legends the Melungeons told about themselves, and the legends outsiders told about them, they almost all point away from Africa, towards something more exotic. Shipwrecked Portuguese sailors, stranded on the Carolina coast, intermarrying with local tribes. Descendants of Sir Francis Drake's freed Ottoman Turkish prisoners, swallowed into the Appalachian hills. Survivors of the lost Roanoke colony, the English settlers who vanished in 1587 and were never found. Even Phoenicians and Carthaginians got floated as an explanation at one point, in an actual courtroom, by an actual lawyer, trying to win an actual case. Every one of these stories is exotic. Every one of these stories is romantic. And every one of these stories conveniently avoids the one origin that, in 19th century Tennessee, could cost you your vote, your land, and your legal standing as a citizen. That pattern alone should make you suspicious. It made genealogists suspicious too, decades before anyone had access to a DNA lab. To understand why the origin story mattered so much, you have to go back further than Newman's Ridge, back to Virginia in the 1600s, before slavery in America had hardened into the rigid, race-based system it would later become. In that earlier world, indentured servitude crossed racial lines more freely. Black and white servants worked the same fields, lived in the same quarters, and sometimes formed families together before the law caught up and made that illegal. Genealogists researching the core Melungeon surnames, Collins, Gibson, Goins, Bunch, have traced them back to exactly this world. Free people of color in colonial Virginia and North Carolina descended from unions between African men and European women generations before anyone in Hancock County was born. That's not speculation. It's documentary research. Genealogist Paul Heinig spent years combing court records, tax rolls, and property deeds across Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, reconstructing the family trees of free black communities in colonial America. And the core Melungeon surnames kept showing up inside that record. These families migrated together, generation after generation, moving from Virginia into North Carolina, then into East Tennessee, arriving on Newman's Ridge and in the valley of Vardy around 1790. A Hawkins County deed places a man named Millington Collins in the area by 1802. Two names in particular, Vardy Collins and Shepherd Gibson, appear to have settled the valley that would later carry Vardy Collins' own name. Local historian Lewis Jarvis, writing in 1903, described the settlers on the ridge as friendly Indians who arrived alongside the earliest white pioneers, a tidy, reassuring version of events, positioning the community as indigenous rather than migrants. It's a good story. The genealogical record tells a different one. These families came in from Virginia and North Carolina along the exact same migration routes as their English, Scots-Irish, and German neighbors, carrying the exact same legal vulnerability with them the whole way. Here is where the suspicion moments start stacking up, one on top of the next. In 1834, Tennessee rewrote its state constitution, and one clause quietly stripped free persons of color of the right to vote. For families already living on the edge of racial classification, this was an existential threat. Lose your classification as white, and you lost your vote, your right to testify in court against a white citizen, your right to own land freely. So watch what happens to the paperwork after 1834. On the 1820 census in Floyd County, Kentucky, Collins and Gibson households are marked free persons of color. On the 1830 census in Hawkins County, Tennessee, they're marked free colored again. But by 1840, some of those exact same families are recorded as white. Same names, same farms, same neighbors, filling out the form, different answer. That's not a clerical accident happening once. It's a pattern repeating across decades. Flip forward to the 1880 census. An enumerator's write port or portagee next to some of these households, then strike it through and write W for white over top of it. Someone actively steered the record, not once. Across generations, across different census years, across different counties, the same families keep landing on a racial classification that keeps sliding around depending on who's asking, what year it is, and what's at stake. And the stakes were not abstract. In 1846, a group of Melungeon men in Hawkins County were hauled into court and tried for the crime of voting while allegedly not white. A man walks to the polling place, casts a legal ballot, and is arrested for it, not because he broke a rule, but because a neighbor decided his blood disqualified him before he ever reached the ballot box. Most were acquitted, But the fact that the trials happened at all tells you the classification wasn't just gossip. It was enforceable. It could take away your rights in a courtroom. Then, in 1872, the argument reached its most strangest and most revealing moment. A Hamilton County case, remembered as the celebrated Melungeon case, turned on whether a Melungeon woman named Martha Simmerman had the legal right to inherit property, a right that depended entirely on whether her family counted as white. Her lawyer stood up in that courtroom and argued, with a straight face, that the family were pure-blooded Carthaginians, not African, not mixed, descendants of an ancient Mediterranean civilization that had been extinct for 2,000 years. It sounds absurd today. It won the case. The court ruled the Melungeons were not of African descent, and inheritance rights that depended on that ruling were preserved. Decades later, in 1915, the presiding judge, Lewis Shepard, wrote his own memoir recounting the trial, describing the Carthaginian claim almost admiringly as a clever legal maneuver rather than a fiction built out of desperation. Think about what that actually proves. Not that the Carthaginian story was true, nobody believed that, not even the lawyer arguing it. It proves that by 1872, an entire legal system was willing to accept literally any origin story, no matter how implausible, as long as the word that never got said out loud in that courtroom was African. The myth wasn't naive folklore passed down by confused mountain families who lost track of their own history. The myth was working exactly as intended. It was a shield, reinforced generation after generation because the alternative was losing everything, and the danger didn't fade with time. In 1924, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act, one of the most aggressive racial classification laws in American history, built almost entirely around enforcing the one-drop rule. The man behind it, Walter Plecker, ran Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics for over 3 decades, and he kept lists, surname lists, of families he suspected of passing as white or as Native American while carrying African ancestry, and he used those lists to hunt down birth and marriage records and forcibly reclassify people as colored against their will, sometimes decades after the fact. Families connected to the Melungeon surnames were on those lists. A state official, with the power of the law behind him, treated their bloodline as a problem to be corrected on paper. So by the 20th century, you have 2 competing versions of the same people. One version, quiet and defensive, built out of necessity, and one version, louder and more romantic, that exploded into public consciousness in 1994 when N. Brent Kennedy published a book called The Melungeons, The Resurrection of a Proud People. Kennedy, who traced his own ancestry to these families, argued for a sweeping Mediterranean origin: Turkish, Portuguese, Moorish, Sephardic Jewish, mixed with Native American blood. A story of shipwrecked sailors and lost soldiers scattered across the Appalachian hills, centuries before the United States existed. The book landed at exactly the right cultural moment and set off a full-scale heritage revival. People who'd never heard the word Melungeon before started tracing their family trees, buying into an identity that felt exotic, ancient, and above all, safely non-black. It felt good. It felt proud. And almost immediately, it ran into a problem. Genealogist and historian Virginia DeMarce, a past president of the National Genealogical Society, went back through Kennedy's own family tree using the actual public record, deeds, tax rolls, court documents, and censuses. In a lengthy 1996 review published in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly, she laid out what she found, and it was almost the exact opposite of what Kennedy claimed. Not a single instance where his named ancestors appeared in the historical record as anything but white, generation after generation, from 1790 clear through to 1900. If there was a hidden Turkish or Mediterranean bloodline in these specific family lines, the paperwork didn't show it. That should have settled the debate. It didn't. Kennedy's version was simply more appealing, and by the mid-1990s, it had momentum the paper trail couldn't match. The Turkish and Mediterranean story became the default explanation offered in tourism brochures and casual conversation across Hancock County. Two irreconcilable stories were now circulating at the same time, one built on documents, one built on a best-selling narrative, and there was no way to settle it with paperwork alone. There was only one kind of evidence left that neither side could argue with: blood. A father passes the Y chromosome down to his sons, largely unchanged, generation after generation, almost like a genetic surname. Mitochondrial DNA works the same way down the maternal line, mother to child. Neither one tells you everything, but together they act like two separate paper trails, written in blood instead of ink, and unlike a census taker in 1840, they can't be talked into writing down the wrong answer. The first real attempt came around the turn of the millennium. A British molecular biologist named Kevin Jones, working out of the University of Virginia's College at Wise, with geneticist Mark Thomas of University College London, ran genetic tests on a documented sample of Melungeon descendants. The results, unveiled around 2002, pointed toward a broad Eurasian ancestry, from Scandinavia to the Middle East, with smaller traces of African and Native American heritage folded in. It sounded, on the surface, like it might support Kennedy's theory, but the study was small, its methodology thin, and it was never formally published in a peer-reviewed journal, a false lead dressed up as an answer. The real test came a decade later, from inside the community itself. Jack Goins, a Hawkins County archivist who had spent years tracing his own family line, launched a formal genetic genealogy project in 2005, recruiting documented descendants of the historically recognized Melungeon families. This wasn't a casual swab kit. It was restricted specifically to family lines that appeared in the actual 19th century Melungeon records, cross-checked against real documents before a single cheek swab was collected. Working alongside genetic genealogists, Roberta Estes, Penny Ferguson, and Janet Lewis Crane, the team tested Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA across 69 documented male lines and 8 female lines. In 2012, they published their findings in the peer-reviewed Journal of Genetic Genealogy under the title Melungeons, a multi-ethnic population. It remains, to this day, the only formally peer-reviewed genetic study of this community ever published, and it later won the North Carolina Society of Historians Paul Green Multimedia Award. And what it found broke the story wide open. Across the core surnames, Bunch, Collins, Gibson, Goins, Minor, Nichols, the dominant male line DNA wasn't Turkish. It wasn't Portuguese. It wasn't Native American. It was African. Specifically, haplogroup E1B1B1A, a Y chromosome signature strongly associated with sub-Saharan Africa, turned up across line after line, name after name that had spent 2 centuries insisting otherwise. One line in the Goins family carried an even older African marker, haplogroup A. The maternal lines told a matching story from the opposite direction. Every single mitochondrial line tested came back European, haplogroup H. Put those 2 threads together, and a picture snaps into focus. African men, European women, unions that predate the hardening of American slavery law, their descendants staying close together, intermarrying within the same small circle of families, all the way down to Hancock County, Tennessee. The Associated Press picked up the story that May, and the study's own conclusion was blunt. The families historically identified as Melungeon descended from sub-Saharan African men and white women of Northern or Central European origin, not shipwrecked sailors, not Ottoman prisoners, not Carthaginian nobility. An interracial couple, or several, in 17th century Virginia at a moment in American history when that kind of union was still legally possible before the walls closed in. And this wasn't a fluke turning up in one isolated family. Researchers later tested additional documented paternal lines outside the original sample, and the same African signature turned up again, in lines that didn't share a common recent ancestor. That rules out the simplest counter-explanation, one adoption or one mislabeled record generations back. The African ancestry wasn't a single accident buried in one family tree. It was woven independently through multiple unrelated core lines. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. Jack Goins, the man who spent years building this very project, tested African on his own paternal line. The researcher who ran the study to find the truth found it sitting inside his own bloodline first. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. The result didn't just answer the old question. It exposed a new one, sitting right next to it. Remember the oral history, the friendly Indians Lewis Jarvis described? The tribal ancestry so many descendants had grown up believing was fact. When the 2012 study went looking for that Native American paternal signal across the documented core surnames, it found almost nothing. A single Native paternal marker turned up in the entire study, and it belonged to a family that had married into the community from the outside, not one of the original core bloodlines. The story that felt most emotionally true to descendants was the one the genetics could barely find at all. So the test didn't just replace one myth with a fact. It replaced one myth with two open wounds. The African ancestry the community had spent 2 centuries hiding turned out to be real and central. The Native American ancestry the community had spent 2 centuries celebrating turned out to be, at best, a minor thread stitched in from outside. Every assumption these families carried about themselves got inverted at once. Word spread fast once the study went public, and the reaction was not uniform celebration. Roberta Estes, the lead researcher, later said plainly that a lot of people were upset by what the study found. They just knew they were Portuguese, she said, or Native American. Decades of identity, built carefully around a story that felt proud and safe, ran headlong into a laboratory result that offered something else. A story that was harder, more human, and in its own way more remarkable, but not the story anyone had been telling at reunions and heritage festivals for 100 years. And here's where the story stops being about ancestry and starts being about power. Because Kennedy's book never disappeared. His Mediterranean theory still circulates in Hancock County, more than a decade after the genetic evidence contradicted it directly. That's not really surprising when you think about what each version cost the person telling it. The Turkish and Portuguese story costs nothing. It's colorful, safe, and requires no reckoning with America's racial history. The DNA story costs something real, and it asks a family to sit with the fact that their ancestors built and maintained a cover story for 200 years, not out of confusion, but out of necessity, in a country where the truth could get you disenfranchised or worse. Ask who actually benefits from each version staying alive, and the tension gets sharper. Heritage tourism in Hancock County runs, in part, on the romantic version, with visitors coming for the mystery of shipwrecked sailors, not the mechanics of colonial indentured servitude. And that story sells books and fills conference rooms in a county that has spent a long time economically struggling. The DNA version doesn't have that same commercial pull. It's heavier, and it implicates the exact legal system that once had the power to strip these families of their rights. Nobody here is a villain for preferring the version that cost them less. But the more comfortable myth had every incentive to survive the discovery that undercut it. And it did. That tension lives on today in places you can still visit. The Vardy Community Historical Society restored the old 1899 Vardy Presbyterian Church and turned it into a small museum below Newman's Ridge, and later relocated and reconstructed the log cabin of Mahala Big Haley Mullins, a legendary Melungeon woman so large in her later years that local lawmen reportedly joked she was catchable but not fetchable, too heavy to physically remove from her home, so she brewed moonshine there for decades, functionally untouchable by the law. Nearby, Blackwater Baptist Church, one of the original congregations of the community, still holds services. The Melungeon Heritage Association still holds an annual gathering, drawing descendants back to trade research and argue, gently or not so gently, over which version of the story belongs to them. It isn't just an academic argument anymore, either. Descendants who grew up hearing the Portuguese or Native American version of the family story have started spitting into 23 and Me and Ancestry DNA kits, and some of them got a small echo of Jack Goins' experience, ethnicity estimates that didn't match the legend they'd inherited. Consumer results aren't as precise as a peer-reviewed study, so no single kit should be read as final proof. But the pattern keeps repeating, enough to keep the old argument alive at kitchen tables far from Tennessee. And this is where the deeper conflict really lives now, not in a courtroom, not in a 19th century census, but in the messier question of who gets to claim this identity at all. Kennedy's book pulled in descendants from far beyond the original 40 or so documented core families. Today, thousands of people identify as Melungeon descendants with no genealogical paper trail connecting them to Newman's Ridge at all. So which definition wins? The narrow, documented bloodline the 2012 study actually tested, or the broader, emotionally adopted identity Kennedy's book set loose on the world 30 years ago? Nobody has settled that argument because it isn't really a scientific question anymore. It's a question about who owns a name that started as an insult. Consider too what the DNA study didn't do. It didn't erase the danger these families lived through. If anything, it confirmed exactly why the cover story existed in the first place. The African ancestry wasn't a scandal waiting to be uncovered. It was a fact these families had every rational reason to hide, in a legal system that would strip their rights the moment the truth became official, reframe it that way, and the 200-year Portuguese story stops looking like naive folklore. It starts looking like one of the longest-running acts of quiet resistance in American history, an entire community across generations engineering a survivable fiction and defending it in court, in church minutes, on census forms, against a legal system built to punish the truth. That reframing is disputed, and it should be treated that way. There's no signed confession. The intent behind the Portuguese and Turkish legends can't be proven with the same certainty as a Y chromosome haplogroup. But look at the timing. Look at the pattern. Free persons of color in 1830. White by 1840. Portuguese struck through and overwritten with the letter W in 1880. Carthaginians in a courtroom in 1872. Argued by a lawyer who surely didn't believe it, in front of a judge who ruled in the family's favor anyway. That doesn't prove intent beyond doubt, but it makes the simple explanation that these families simply lost track of their own history much harder to defend than it used to be. What's left, in the end, is not a solved mystery. It's a folder. Somewhere in the Vardy Community Museum, inside that restored 1899 church, sits a small display of Melungeon heritage, old photographs, family trees, the Portuguese and Turkish legends, printed on placards for visiting tourists, told the way they were told for 100 years before the lab results came back. Not far from that display, in archives held by people like Jack Goins and Roberta Estes, sits the genetic record E1B1A and haplogroup H, African fathers and European mothers, 17th century Virginia, refusing to stay buried. Both versions occupy the same small valley, sometimes the same building. Neither one has fully replaced the other. The legend survives because it once had to. The science survives because it finally could. Jack Goins still lives with both. The man who built the very project that overturned 2 centuries of family legend now carries a Y chromosome result that says something his ancestors spent their whole lives trying to keep unsaid. Somewhere in Hancock County, that envelope is still sitting in a file. And every family reunion, every heritage festival, every tourist walking through that little museum on the valley floor still has to choose, consciously or not, which version of the story they're going to believe. Because that's what this was always really about. Not sailors, not Carthaginians, not a single origin waiting to be uncovered. It was about a family, and then dozens of families, standing at the edge of a truth their ancestors calculated, correctly, that America would punish. The paperwork lied for 200 years because the paperwork had to. The blood, when it finally spoke, didn't ask permission.